Hi everyone, this is Jamie and welcome to another episode of the Yogi Within podcast. Okay, so on today's episode, I think I will come up with a name later. This one might encompass a few things, but this is mostly derived from a few conversations I've had lately and a few experiences I've had, especially in the past 2 or 3 weeks, and a conversation I had with a student with the other day. You could say reignited this particular conversation around what we're doing in our yoga practice. And really, I might start this off with let's start this off with a question that you might pose, which is the Ashtanga Yoga system in itself injurious, in the sense that by nature, practicing Ashtanga Yoga, Mysore style Ashtanga Yoga, is this an injurious way to practice asana? So I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to give my opinion on that, and then I'm going to expand on that with some things I've experienced recently, and one of my favorite stories in Buddhism, actually, that will tie into this, and it will make sense a bit later. So, is the Ashtanga Yoga system injurious by nature? I would say it's nuanced. Yeah, it's not. I would say no, in a way, and I would say it's largely, like most things, is like how it's practiced. I've done many sports, lots of different things with my body over the years, and I've picked up a myriad of different imbalances and injuries from doing those things. And also, it's quite common for people to have lots of pain and imbalances in their body from doing nothing, from sitting too much. So it's really, it's how you do things and the intention you take towards things. Now, do you need to do primary series or intermediate series, for example, to have a balanced body? No. My answer to that is no. There's actually other, you could say that there's more simplistic movement practices and less strenuous practices to have a balanced body. I would argue that. I would say that we're all drawn to different things, and I'll explain that a little bit later. But to just have a if you're just interested in having a little bit less pain in your body, a little bit more mobility, I would say that there are potentially other systems or other sequences that are more what's the word? Not balanced, but just maybe they don't go so deep. Yeah, I've said this before. The standing postures in primary series, or in the Ashtanga system, are excellent. I haven't found anything better than that. One of the reasons I created my Element series is because I've met a lot of practitioners who struggled with primary series. So I created a sequence that was a little bit more balanced in nature. But if you're a Mysore style practitioner, then working your way through primary series is essential. So these are different things. I've spoken about this before on other podcasts, but is it injurious in nature? It depends how you practice. I would say that for Westerners and Western bodies, they have to be more careful and more patient working with the system. As I've said previously, if you're sitting all day at a job or you have a very competitive mindset, then applying those things to primary series is going to potentially cause injury. You have to be very patient with the system, and you have to let your body develop and open slowly as you progress through the system. It is a wonderful system if it's practiced correctly, and obviously you need to find a good teacher and a good room that enables that to happen in a holistic way. But applying a competitive type A personality to the series is really only going to lead to potential injury. But this came up from talking to a student the other day, and I've been thinking about some of this for a while. But I think it really comes down to what your intention is with the practice. Yeah. Personally, primary series, and if you've opened your back enough that you can do drop backs, is amazing. I mean, actually, I've done that quite a lot the last 2 weeks for various reasons, but primary series, Urdhva Dhanurasana drop backs, my body feels excellent after that. It feels so nice. Working through intermediate series is a different type of challenge, and I would say that for most people they don't really need to do that. I would say primary series and learning the back bends in intermediate that lead up to Kapotasana, say up to Ustrasana for example, is excellent. It's so good. That really balances the body out. I would say Kapotasana and beyond, it's not for everyone. Really, it really isn't for everyone. It's not everyone's desire to work that deeply into different movements. And for beginners or people that haven't really seen Ashtanga Yoga, even looking at primary series can look pretty wild, when you see Kurmasana and Supta Kurmasana and things like this. So, when you've been doing it for a while, these movements get normalized. And actually, once your body gets used to them, you realize actually these aren't very extreme, and these actually feel pretty good. And again, especially the back bends in intermediate that lead up to Ustrasana. So again, it really depends on your intention and what you want from this, but I would say that is not injurious. Working through primary series, you have to be delicate with the hips and knees in things like Marichasana D, for example. I've spoken about that before on my kind of breakdown of primary series, but by nature, I wouldn't say it's injurious. I would just say it's more about how it's applied and unfortunately how it's taught. As I've said before, teachers that are very rigid with the system, that don't allow adaptations for different students' body types, to me this is injurious. Yeah, I've seen lots of injuries from it being taught that way. Actually, a student of mine noted this morning, she's got a bit of a hamstring injury, and we talked a little bit about drop backs, and she's got a bit of a wrist thing going on. And, she was just dropping back into Urdhva Dhanurasana, and I was helping her up just because, what's going on with her wrist. And, we joked a little bit. And I said, yeah, I was, made to learn drop backs just doing primary series with no extra back bends. And I had to come up first. And to be honest, that sucked. It was not good for my back. And she laughed and joked about it. She was like, I'm so glad you don't teach it that way here. And I was like, yeah, I don't teach it that way for a reason. It's like, for most people, it's not good. So I think that in the sense of being rigid and dogmatic with the system, I would say that potentially this is injurious. If you have a teacher or a room that is highly competitive and someone's pushing you through the system and the energy is you have to keep progressing, that potentially is injurious for sure. I don't teach it that way. I don't look at the asanas that in it that way. My intention with this is not like that. It's interesting to move forward, and it's great to see people change, and I'll talk about that later. It's fascinating to see that. It's fascinating to see people's mind shift and their perception of themselves shift through different body movements. It's a beautiful thing, but ultimately I'm not so interested in that, in the sense of how deep people go. It's more about their relationship to themselves and the practice itself. And, are they being kind to themselves? Are they practicing yoga, or are they practicing competitive gymnastics? I've spoken about that enough in the past. So really, it's like, how deep do you want to go? Not everyone needs to work towards catching their heels in Kapotasana. I mean, it's interesting, and over time, it does feel good. I used to dread doing Kapotasana in a way because it was so hard for my body type, my God. But now I really like it. I don't go super deep in it every time. It's okay. But I enjoy it as a posture. It feels good to open your back in that way, and learning complex movements does take time. Kapotasana takes a long time for most people to integrate where that can feel comfortable. For a long time, it will feel very uncomfortable. And to be honest, it might always feel a bit uncomfortable by its nature. Same with other postures like leg behind the head or other types of movement. But you know, they're not injurious in nature if they're practiced in a holistic way. And I think really that's the root of this. You know, it's changing our mindset towards the asana and thinking about it like, what are we doing in these practices? And that really could be the name of this podcast. You know, what are we doing in these practices? What is your intention? What's your goal? You know, what are you trying to achieve in some way? And how do you apply yourself to it? And the conversation I had with one of my students this week was really about how the mind works. This is a mind control methodology. Forget the asana, forget how difficult it is, but really what I mostly observe in students is an inability to see the fact that your body is not a machine. Yeah, it's not mechanical, it's different every day. This is reality. The mind wants certainty, yeah. It wants control. It wants everything to be the same. This is a very left hemispheric way of viewing things, and the body is not like that. The body doesn't lie. It's different every day, and being embodied, having an embodied practice, grounds you back in reality. It grounds you back into that you are not mechanical. This is not going to be the same every day. You're not the same every day. You're different every day. What you can do is different every day. The feedback from your body is different every day, and you want to make a good relationship with that. Yeah. If that frustrates you and angers you, then you need to practice yoga. Yeah, not competitive sports. You need to practice, you know, letting go, you know, non-attachment. This is what this practice in my view, should be teaching you when you meet that resistance. Yeah, when we meet resistance in the body, you can't ignore it. The mind wants to ignore these things. It wants to create stories. It wants to make you feel better about things. But in my opinion, in a Mysore room, in the Ashtanga room, you're meeting reality. Yeah, the body. What you experience in the body is reality. It's honest. Your mat should be a place of honesty, yeah, where you see yourself, you meet yourself, and you're embodied in that experience, and you accept that that's how that is that day, not trying to force something or create stories. This isn't yoga. This is just adding more levels of being delusional. I'm going to continue with this, but I'll digress and talk about something I did this weekend. Actually, I did martial arts for many years. One of my students, Robert, he's a brown belt in jiu-jitsu, and we, you know, crack a few jokes about, you know, how I used to do this for many years, and he invited me to come down to his gym, and I went there on Saturday, and I haven't done this for many years. It's kind of interesting to check in, and it was fun. It was a good environment. You know, we did a lot of sparring and, you know, competitive rolling and stuff, and it was great. But, you know, that energy in that room is very different. Yeah, this is a competitive fighting sport. The idea is to control and manipulate and dominate. Yeah, and, you know, there's a part of me that loves that from a very sort of masculine energy that I like. But really, during that process, my body is a tool. Yeah. I'm using my body as a tool to do something to someone else, to achieve something, to manipulate something, to control something. This is a very left hemispheric way of applying my mind over my body. In a way, you could say that my body is almost a little bit disconnected. Like, I'm in a flow state, I'm moving, I'm doing movements that I've drilled, you know, I don't know how many hours I've drilled those movements for. They're second nature. So I'm in this flow state, but really it's also disconnected because the feedback is not the same as yoga. It's very much about achieving something and doing something. And really, the body is just a tool to do that. It's a very goal-orientated thing to do. And it's disconnected in some way. These are very different practices. Even though fighting sports are very honest. This is another reason why I was drawn to fighting sports. There's an honesty there that you can't ignore. Yeah, whether you win, whether you lose, the person you're fighting, you're sparring, it's honest. It's one of the most honest things I've ever done, and that's why I loved it for so many years. And it's also why I love the practice of my home practice with my mat. It's one of the most honest things that I do. Yeah, it's a very embodied, honest practice. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because it reminded me of how it depends on your intention. I was talking to another one of my students this morning, Alex, who's a boxing coach, and he was a competitive pro boxer for many years here in Norway. And it's interesting to think how we can create stories. I remember when I used to fight a lot when I was younger, and I used to think that there's people that learn faster and there was people that learnt slower. And the ones that learnt slower were generally the people that after fighting, if they lost, they would create a bunch of stories as to why they lost. They weren't really interested in finding out why they lost. They weren't really interested in improving their technique so that they could learn for the future. They mostly just wanted to tell you a story that they had in their head as to why they think they lost that day. And that story was a lie. Yeah, these were delusional stories that some people would tell themselves to make themselves feel better about being very uncomfortable. Their ego was bruised, and they didn't want to deal with that. They wanted to pretend that they just had an off day, or you were stronger, or some other kind of story. It's fascinating. And the ones that learnt very fast were the ones that got beaten up. They lost the match or whatever, but straight away they were very curious as to why. They would ask lots of questions as to why they lost, and then they would want to go again. And I would always look at those younger students and think, yeah, that guy's going to learn super quick. That his ego was dropped. He didn't really care that he lost. He was mostly conscious of learning and, letting go of the fact that he lost. That wasn't really important. The reason he was there was to learn. Some people come to fighting sports to grow their ego, and those people don't really become very good. They tend to kind of get stuck and stagnated because they're afraid to try things and they're afraid to lose. So they create this prison for themselves in a way. The ones that evolve and learn quickly are the ones that are able to drop their ego and just focus on learning. The goal is to learn and improve. And I think that you can apply that to most things in life. But really, the reason I'm bringing this up is because really this is about how you deal with being uncomfortable. There is something that happens with pressure. There is something that happens with being uncomfortable physically. This is it affects your nervous system in a very strong way. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu makes you extremely uncomfortable physically. Wrestling, judo, other things that I've done, they're extremely hard on the body, and that's one of the reasons I don't really do them anymore. Especially judo and wrestling. It's very physically it breaks the body down basically in not a great way. It kind of is very injurious by nature. Fighting sports, I would say yoga's not, but fighting sports are very injurious by their nature, more than any other sport I've ever done, just by the nature of what you're trying to do. And it breaks the body down. Yoga heals the body, to me. Sports, competitive sports, but especially fighting competitive sports, it really breaks the body down. It's hard on the body, but there's something about pressure and being physically uncomfortable. And I think to me this was always been the fascinating aspect of Ashtanga Yoga, because by its nature it's like that. There's so much compression and squeezing and twisting, more than any other style of yoga, I would say. When you think about primary series, there's so much squeezing and twisting and compressing inwards. By its nature, it's uncomfortable in that way. Postures like Kapotasana are extremely uncomfortable, especially when you're learning those, which is why students tend to have such strong experiences from those types of postures. But I've also had students that have very strong reactions to very basic postures. Yeah, it's not necessarily how complex the movement is, but it's more the feeling you have from that resistance. And this could be a very basic twist. This could be a very basic internal rotation, such as Marichyasana A. This could be a type of hip opener that, where there's a lot of resistance. And mostly what I see and experience is people meeting themselves when there is a lot of resistance. And really how you handle that, how you deal with that resistance, especially if something very negative comes up, is mostly what your yoga practice is trying to teach you, yeah? The mind will want to create stories, yeah? It will want to avoid those things. It will want to divert, not come back, make a story up as to why that's like that. This is something I witness a lot. I've witnessed a lot in, back in my sort of competitive fighting sports days. And, there's stories, the mind will just create story after story after story to avoid being uncomfortable. As I've said before, you learn a lot about yourself from being in uncomfortable positions. I'm not saying that you need to seek out pain or discomfort, but just by its nature, there is something about being physically uncomfortable that creates growth. Yeah, I have this vision and image of, the butterfly escaping the cocoon. It gets stronger by pushing its wings against its encasing. Yeah, if you were to make that opening easier, the butterfly's wings would not be strong enough to fly once it's open. To me, this is a beautiful analogy around how resistance and strength, can create something very beautiful. And I think that we can't make things too easy in a way. My goal as an Ashtanga teacher isn't really to make things easy for people, because I think that lots of growth and beautiful things come from change, and it comes from resistance and pressure and basically becoming stronger. So the analogy of a butterfly to me is very beautiful, and how it emerges through that resistance. And I think that this is how I think about the Ashtanga Yoga system. Now, could that cause injury along the way? Potentially, yeah. Even with a great teacher who's very good at adjusting and who is very loving and kind, things happen even with the best intentions by its nature. It's a very rigorous physical practice. By its nature, sometimes things happen. And it doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it or can't do it. It's just, part of the journey a little bit. And I think that trying to baby everything and cotton wool everything doesn't really help practitioners. I believe in making people strong and resilient and less fearful. I think that people have better lives and they do more with their life when they don't feel like such a victim, and actually they feel strong and confident and resilient. And it's fun to try things, it's fun to fail. Your body's very strong, it's very resilient, it's very good at healing. That's the way I view yoga, as the Ashtanga Yoga system, and the body in general is, confidence and positivity and, a positive mindset towards body movement. Something I come across a lot in teaching is half of my job, I think, is just unraveling and undoing old negative patterns, but also just like negative things that students will have from other types of therapists. I've spoken a little bit about this before, but I feel like lots of different healthcare practitioners have a very pessimistic view of body movement and health, and these create very negative attachment patterns in students' minds towards pain and injury, and that alone will just make things feel 1,000 times worse when someone tells you you can't do something and you shouldn't do something and this is risky, and all of these kinds of negative approaches to body movement that I don't even believe are true. Most of the time when I see people that come to the Shala or I meet who have these stories associated to pain and injury, I would say 99% of the time those aren't even true, and it's mostly based around fear and an overprotective attitude towards body movement. I've learned so much more about my body from trying and being positive and seeing what happens. And really from that I learned that actually my body is super strong, very resilient, it heals very fast, and having a positive mindset towards that is life-changing. It can feel so draining and like a low vibration when you have a very negative attitude towards body movement and being able to heal your body. So just to kind of recap on that, so I don't think Ashtanga Yoga in essence is injurious in that way. And most of the times when I've seen students have injuries in yoga, it's usually because they've had a very bad adjustment from a teacher that, or it's an old injury and there's some scar tissue there and that needs to be revisited. Some students have things happen in the room, but again, sometimes they just happen. Like I say, with all good intention purposes, sometimes things can tear, and sometimes things can be a little bit misaligned and out of place. Ultimately we don't want this to happen, but it is a physical practice. Sometimes things happen, and hopefully you're practicing with a good teacher who kind of sees that and helps you through that healing process. But ultimately it will lead to a more positive change. In my experience with the system, if you're patient and you work on the strength side as much as you do on flexibility, ultimately I think the body becomes stabilized and the more complex postures become easier, and everything just starts to realign. But it's just really understanding the complexity of it, like the complexity of the human organism, and being patient with the system and trusting that if you practice it in a holistic way, that those imbalances will be readdressed. And in my experience doing this for many years, that is 1,000% true. It's just the approach and being patient with the system. But let's move on a little bit. Let's move on a little bit in terms of metaphors. Now, I just use this metaphor of the butterfly, and there's various different religious texts, spiritual stories around transformation. And I think largely that's what these practices are about. We all come to yoga for different reasons, but some of us want to go deeper, not all of us. And this is a good thing to ask yourself. I had this, someone asked me this many years ago, but it's good to check in with yourself, like why are you doing this? And this will change over the years, I believe. What's the reason you're doing yoga? What's at the heart of it? What is it you want to explore? As I said before, I wanted to know myself better, but really my nature, Jamie, I always want to go deeper. The type of person I am, that's my nature, is to go as deep as I can with something. I'm very much like that. My nature is to just explore something to its fullest as much as I can. I like that. It's something I enjoy. But not all of us want to do that. Some of us, it could just be wanting to just have some better mobility, a little bit less pain in our body, and we can use the Ashtanga system like that. Not all of us want to go into intermediate series in that way, and not all of us should. I mean, really, as it's kind of said in the tradition that intermediate series potentially is really for teachers, and advanced is really for demonstrations. For primary series, if it's modified enough for different body types, can be for everyone if the backbends are incorporated to balance that out, or if you practice something like my element series that is a little bit more balanced in nature. But it really depends how far you want to go and what you're doing it for, what you're using it for. As I've said before, most of the time, most of the reasons that I practice daily is not for physical reasons. It's mostly for the psychological check-in and the kind of commitment to that. Yeah, I've talked about that a lot before, but really, I've always loved this idea of transformation, and this is very much told in different traditions. When we think of the butterfly, or water to wine, there's always these metaphors in different religious traditions of transformation, in the sense that we grow in some way, or we learn something new about ourselves. Something becomes better, lighter, reborn. There's this rebirth, and this is nuanced. Yeah, a lot of yogic practices and traditions are about accepting yourself as you are, and being in love with yourself in that way, in the sense that you are good as you are. You're good enough. Yeah, and that alone is difficult for a lot of us, to be accepting of who we are as we are, and feeling like we don't need to change. And I think that this gets a little bit confusing when we read these different texts and we study these different texts from different religions, because on one hand we've got this idea that we're good as we are and we're perfect as we are, but on the other hand we have all these transformation practices, that the idea is that we need to transform and change, and in reality it's both. Yeah, what we're looking for is bandha. I'm always going to go back to this. What we're looking for is this balanced state. Now, if you feel balanced in who you are, as you are, then there really isn't so much need to change. Sometimes, for many of us, we are very much out of balance, and we need practices to see ourselves in a truer way, to understand where we are out of balance. These are what these practices are for. Primary series, intermediate series, it doesn't really matter what it is. Meditation, different types of Buddhist meditations. The intention is this rebalancing, this understanding of ourselves and understanding our truer nature. Really, as I tend to bang on a lot about on this podcast, it's around truth. My fighting days was about truth. It was a very true thing to do. My self-practice at home is largely that. It's an embodied, truthful check-in of how Jamie is that day. Obviously, we have all the other benefits that go along with it, but really, what were spiritual seekers, what were they seeking? What are they seeking? I see myself as a spiritual seeker, someone who is searching, looking. You're trying to find deeper levels of truth and understanding about yourself and the nature of reality. Now, I'm going to tell a quick story because it's one of my favorites. I'll try not to bastardize it, and I'll try and do it in a more simpler form because it's a long story. But in Tibetan Buddhism, there is the story of Marpa and Milarepa. This is my favorite story, really. And if you don't know this one, I recommend that you check it out. I'm sure there's YouTube videos on it, or they might even buy audio books or different books. But it's my favorite for different reasons and personal reasons. Marpa was a very famous Lama in Tibet, and he was very known for translating texts. That's what he was really known for, but he was known for being a very good teacher in Buddhism. Milarepa ended up becoming a very famous saint or sage, you could say, and his story is very famous in Tibet and northern India, because really it's around a lot of transformation and perseverance, you could say. And I think that it's admirable in a sense what Milarepa went through to reach a state of potential enlightenment, as the stories are told. But anyway, just quickly, the story is Milarepa grew up in a family where his father died, and he was about to get his inheritance when he became an adult. And his uncle and aunt were kind of trustees of this estate of funds, and were bestowed to take care of that until Milarepa came of age. They didn't do that. They basically stole the money and sent his mother and Milarepa to kind of do hard labor for many years, and then basically kicked him out of the village and stole the money. So this is a very hard story, and Milarepa as a young boy had a hard life. He lost his father, his aunt and uncle turned on him, stole his money and kicked his family out. They found refuge with their aunts and uncle from another village, and Milarepa was sent away to study with the idea of taking revenge. Milarepa was sort of, you could say, manipulated by his mother, who was angry and hurt, and she funneled that anger and hurt into her son, that he should get revenge and he should get the money back, and he should take this vengeful anger back out on his uncle and aunt. So Milarepa went away and studied with a lama, but he studied the dark arts. You could think of this in a bit like Star Wars, with the light and the dark, but he studied the dark side of Tibetan traditional, you could say shamanistic practices, because a lot of practices from that area are shamanistic in nature. And he found a teacher that helped him funnel this anger and rage into a negative way, and this was used as a way to hurt people. And the short version of this is that Milarepa gained a lot of insights and was able to use these teachings as a way to inflict pain on people from the village that he was kicked out of, where a bunch of people actually died. And you could say that Milarepa, and really his mother, who manipulated him into doing this, were the cause of lots of people's death. The uncle and aunt survived, and this was on purpose because he wanted them to really just watch the misery that he'd created. So this is a very vengeful act, and obviously very bitter and resentful. And through the process of doing this, Milarepa became very damaged, and he really started to feel the weight of what he'd caused. And also Milarepa's teacher started to feel the weight of what he'd taught him. They both felt responsible for the negative actions, the negative karmic actions that they'd done, whether they thought they were justified or not, but ultimately led to a group of people dying, you could say being murdered. So Milarepa, you could say, was a murderer. And then through this process, he then sought out a way to redeem himself and a way to cleanse himself. Initial teacher tried to take him on, but I don't think Milarepa really took it that seriously. He thought that meditation was easy and this would be a quick fix. It was like, great, all I have to do is meditate and I can just get rid of all this bad karma. And because it was easy, he didn't really take it seriously, and he didn't really do any meditation. And eventually this teacher expelled him from the monastery and said, we need to find another teacher for you. So he eventually found Marpa. Now Marpa was not a soft teacher. Now this will make sense why I'm telling this story. This is nothing like yoga today. Yeah, this is nothing like why people will seek out spiritual teachers anymore. Yeah, Marpa was very hard on Milarepa. You could say that his teaching techniques was barbaric. By modern day standards, you could say that Marpa was abusive in some ways to Milarepa and mistreated him. He's put him through years of hard labor, was generally quite mean to him, to the point of trying to break him down to his lowest point. And this was through various different types of manual labor and mistreatment, you could say, if you looked at this externally. Now Marpa's wife would intervene and tell Marpa to back off, you're being too hard on the boy. And she played in some way a mother figure to Marpa, and you could say to Milarepa, and you could say that Marpa played a father figure to Milarepa, but you could say that his techniques and tactics were pretty savage, to be honest. When you read the story and what he put him through, the types of manual labor that he put him through. But really, when you look at Marpa's intention, his intention was actually very much a loving and compassionate one. You could say that Marpa knew at a deep level that Milarepa really had to go through this kind of ego death, this breakdown of who he was as a person, to see himself in his truest form. Now, most yoga practitioners would not want to go through anything like this. And I'm not advocating for this for yoga practitioners. This is inhumane in many ways. But it's an interesting story, because through this egotistical breakdown of Milarepa and him seeing himself more truly, seeing his mother more truthfully, and coming to a place of love and compassion for himself, what he'd done, his mother and what she'd done, and even his aunt and uncle of what they'd done to him, Milarepa found peace and love and compassion. And Marpa was very much responsible for taking him through this ego breakdown. Now, the reason this was so intense is because Marpa had never had a student like Milarepa before. He'd never had a student that was so devoted and so disciplined to kind of pursuing this path. And I think the story of Milarepa is famous for that his devotion and his pursuit for balancing out his karmic actions from the past, and also seeking out these deeper aspects of reality and the truth around reality, was unbreakable. And I think really that inspired Marpa to take him further down this path. And I think that even surprised Marpa how much he could kind of take him through this ego death process. You could say that this is the deepest potential pursuit of a yogic practitioner, to the point where they reach this state of bandha, or as Buddhists would say, enlightenment. And Marpa reached enlightenment in one lifetime, which is kind of unheard of in most Buddhist traditions, and is really generally not really seen as possible, which can happen in the tantric traditions of Buddhism, where potentially, this might happen in one lifetime. So this happened in one lifetime for Marpa, but he had to go through something very, very arduous, you could say painful, extremely uncomfortable, but this made him a very loving, compassionate and strong person. Now, I'm not bringing this story up to say that this is what yoga practitioners should go through in modern day, but I'm using it as an example to say that very good things can happen from being strong. Very good things can happen for going through very uncomfortable phases in life, through very difficult, arduous things. I'm not saying that we need to seek that out, but it's interesting what the mind wants to do when we're in these spaces. It wants to get away, it wants to get out, it wants to create stories, it wants to reinforce our ego, even if that means lying to ourselves, even if that means lying about the past, what's going to happen. The mind will create a myriad of lies and fictitious stories to avoid pain, discomfort, and ultimately accountability. And really, that's kind of Milarepa's story, is that Marpa tried to really show him the truth of what he'd done, the truth of the pain that he'd caused and the suffering that he'd caused to other people, and really the pain and suffering that his mother had also caused to him, and what his aunt and his uncle had done. Now, the story is very long, and I recommend you reading this. It's a really great story. And ultimately, Milarepa's aunt actually ended up becoming one of his students and became a very famous student of his, where she saw the light of what she'd done to Milarepa. So it's a very all-encompassing story around forgiveness, love, compassion, And really, the growth of going through difficult things, the growth of going through things that make us uncomfortable. And I think that society and generally people would be happier if they weren't so worried about being uncomfortable and was much more accepting of things being out of our control and difficult. And I think that these things make us stronger. Milarepa could have been a lifelong victim to what had happened to him, but I don't believe that that helps anybody. I think there is definitely a victim culture in today's society where it's even encouraged. And to me, I spoke about this a little bit on the Ian Greisack podcast. This goes against everything I've ever learned in my life, actually, around growth and accountability. And really, it's gone against everything I've learned in spiritual traditions. Yeah. I know religion is not really something that is sort of promoted these days, but there's lots of great things from religious stories and texts and practices around being stronger and going through difficult things and being accountable, seeking out truth. Truth is the ultimate, yeah? Truth is the ultimate growth factor. When we start telling lies and we start creating stories and truth goes out the window, then, we're lost. I really think that as individuals, we lose so much when we lose truth. And it doesn't go away anyway, yeah? The mind doesn't really want truth, if I can think about it like this. The mind wants safety. It wants things to be easy and comfortable. That's what I would say the mind wants. The body, the feedback from the body is honest. The subconscious wants truth. The subconscious wants bandha. This is why meditation is important. If you're in your mind all the time, then you're just very much in this sense of safety and potentially creating stories to achieve that sense of safety. And really being disembodied will encourage that. The body doesn't lie, the feedback from the body doesn't lie, and this will bring the things from the subconscious to the conscious. This is why embodied practices are so important, because it's like digging. You'll dig down, and then the subconscious will bring up what's really there. And this is what Marpa was trying to teach Milarepa. He was trying to bring his subconscious and his deeper subconscious to the surface to see reality, to see the nature of things. And what he achieved in his life was the ultimate nature of reality, potentially. So the subconscious wants bandha. The subconscious is bandha, and it will keep pushing this to you. This is why these things don't go away. This is why people who live fictitious fantasy lives of lies, they're burdened by their subconscious. Because there's always something nagging there. There's always something gnawing. It's like having a splinter, yeah? It's something beneath the surface that's irritating you, and it doesn't go away. People like that, in my experience, don't sleep very well. They avoid things. They try to avoid accountability. They try to avoid quiet spaces. And if I'm being honest, the people I've met that are extremely like that, the people that I've known in my life, they tend to die not very well. They tend to have lots of diseases in the body. And they tend to not live a very well life later in their life. This has just been my experience from witnessing people over the years. How much do I want to say on that? They don't die very well. Yeah, I think if you have high levels of narcissism and negative traits such as that, these only really get worse with age. And I think that it's like a sickness. Yeah. So a good yoga practice will bring these to the surface, so your subconscious is more present. Yeah. So ultimately, we're trying to see ourselves in our truest form, reality. Yeah. This could mean seeing pain and aspects of ourselves we don't want to see, and the impermanence of that. This is really at the root of a lot of yogic practices. When you think of Marpa and Milarepa's story, there's no Kapitasana there. There's no leg behind the head there. There was lots of different physical practices that he did, meditation practices he did, to see himself in a truest form. And actually, what a lot of Milarepa's physical practices were difficult. He was made to build different types of buildings out of stone and then instantly take him apart. Marpa would come back and say, you built it in the wrong way, you need the building to face that way, and he'd make him rebuild it again from scratch. Marpa would create this new building. Sometime later, Milarepa would come back and make him take it all down again and pick it in some way. He was basically testing him. We could disagree, agree to disagree, or agree that this was not a very kind thing to do. But I think the goal behind it was kind of more important when you think about it from an historic text from a different time. That Marpa was trying to break down his ego, and he was trying to use physical, arduous labor to do this, to kind of see himself in a different way. And we could think about our asana practice in that way, not in the sense that we need to punish ourselves. I've seen too much of that in yoga studios. This would be a negative aspect of that. But just to meet ourselves in difficult places, finding love and compassion when we're in an uncomfortable position. And how do you deal with that resistance? This is the key thing. It's like, what is it when you're in that position and the mind gets involved? How do you handle it? What stories does your mind create to avoid it? What stories do we create to avoid discomfort? Because really, change comes from that resistance, that pressure. It's like it's a compression thing. It's very difficult to sort of to explain sometimes, but it really is just a reaction to what happens when we're physically challenged in that way and we meet these kinds of resistance. And I think that Milarepa and Marpa's story is beautiful in many ways, but also savage and brutal in other ways. And I think we have to look at these stories from a different period and a different time and a different culture. And Marpa's teaching was very focused in a certain way. I've spoken about competitiveness in yoga and strictness in yoga in previous podcasts, and we could say that that's not necessarily the best thing in lots of cases, but ultimately I think it comes down to intention. And I think that sometimes we have to kind of meet ourselves in difficult places, and that could be the best thing for us if it's the truth. I'm not against yoga has a kind of fictitious, or has a kind of energy these days of smiley faces, bright lights, love and light, and everything's kind of sweet and rosy. And there's that is a side of yoga that is how it is these days in the West. When I think about Marpa's and Milarepa's story, this was not like that. This was not about memberships or Instagram posts and selling mats and whatever else it's about these days. This was about students seeking out legit teachers to enlighten them, to teach them things about themselves and life. And there was a relationship that was born out of that. And it was interesting. Part of the story was that Marpa's son died not that long before he met Milarepa, and he realized that Milarepa was almost like his new spiritual son, and they had a beautiful relationship, him and his wife, for decades. And it's a really beautiful story that has lots of different aspects to it. But really, that's how these relationships were born back in the day, not just finding, the nicest yoga studio in your area. It was about seeking out different teachers that we connected with that could really give us a bit of a deeper understanding of different aspects of life. And I've always loved this about yogic traditions. And it's also similar in the traditions I practiced in martial arts. I'm still in close contact with most of my peers from my martial arts days. And even my original coach, Andre, I still speak to him. And it's kind of similar to Ashtanga Yoga, actually, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It's got a very strong lineage-based culture. One of the founding members of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, his son, Carlson Gracie Jr., gave my coach his black belt. And, so my tradition sort of follows that lineage, and it's a very sort of special relationship between student and teacher. And I've always, enjoyed that about Ashtanga Yoga too. It's not just about finding a local studio with a good rate and hopefully that fits. It's like yoga's become very much like that these days. And I'm not shitting on it. It's just aspects of it have changed a lot. But I don't really, I've talked about the kind of guru thing previously in the past, but I think there's a lot of really good teachers out there that we can learn from, and especially ones we develop a good relationship with. And I think that good teachers see this in students, that it's okay. It's finding that balance between backing off, seeing yourself that you're good as you are, but also pushing yourself a bit, taking yourself into these uncomfortable places and seeing what happens. Life is short. It's okay to be uncomfortable. We learn a lot. I've learned the most about myself from being in very uncomfortable situations. You learn a lot, you grow a lot from those spaces, as long as the environment is healthy, and it's not this toxic kind of punishment thing that we could say might have been going on between Milarepa and Marlborough. I'll leave it up to you to make your own assumptions about that story, but it obviously wasn't the case for them and their relationship, irrespective of what we think externally. But I think I'll just finish with this really, but actually a couple of things I'll finish with. It's interesting, I won't go into the details of this, but I'm kind of having this with a neighbour at the moment, because there's a lot of delusional stuff going on where I live. I'm actually thinking of moving out of Oslo and moving into the countryside and just living in a little cabin somewhere a bit more peaceful. But it's fascinating to watch someone lie to your face repeatedly, and you know that they're lying, they know they're lying, but the story continues. And I think really the reason I'm saying this is that it's very difficult to find the truth with someone else who is very used to lying to themselves. And I think that if you don't really have a legit embodied practice, it's very easy to stay in your mind and get very used to lying to yourself. It's a very comfortable place to be. Avoiding responsibility and accountability and lying to yourself to reinforce that, to reinforce a fictitious story, in my experience, has become so commonplace in the last 5 to 10 years, more than I've ever experienced in my life. I talked about this a bit on the Ian Grysack podcast, but truth, objective truth, and looking for that, looking to find truth and being reasonable is a good thing to find in life. And I think that really that's at the root and the core of most legit spiritual practices. And again, in martial arts, was being truthful, finding the truth and the clarity and the healing that comes from getting to the core of things, to understand things as they really are and remove these samskaras, these stories that we tell ourselves. And it's like, it's kind of strange to watch someone lie to themselves, observably, lie to themselves. It's kind of a strange scenario. I won't go into the details of that, but let me just finish with this. What I loved about Milarepa's story is that ultimately at the end, he reached what I think is like a cheat code for life. And really, it's just, whatever happens to you, there's lots of reasons why Milarepa could have been lots of negative things in life. And he chose not to, he chose to find love. Even though he'd been through so many things, he could have just been an eternal victim. and blamed everyone else and been resentful for his whole life. And he would have felt justified in that way. And there's an argument to say that he was justified in some ways. But he would have never reached any level of peace or love in himself. And I think that really is a cheat code in life, is that you can think about all the injustices in your life and the injustices in the world and blame people for this and that, but ultimately these things don't lead to love, they don't lead to compassion, and they just lead to more negative energy. And really forgiveness, love and forgiveness is a cheat code, because it just keeps you in that love state for longer. Yeah? If you're just caught up in resentment and blame, and that you're stuck in that as a pattern for your life, it's just toxic. And like I said before, knowing people that have lived their lives that way, it just gets worse as you get older. If you think of something that will age you quicker, it's that harboring resentment, anger, and expressing that in negative ways. It will just stay with you for life. Unfortunately, it's a very self-perpetuating thing that seems to be the way. But love, compassion, being grateful, and using these practices as a way to cultivate that. Like I say, I think really it's a cheat code. But like I say, Milarepa's story, I think a lot of us have felt like that, who've probably been through difficult experiences and had difficult families. You can think, why is this happening to me? Why is my life like that? And, lots of us go through difficult things with difficult families. Some of us have much more difficult families than others. And I think that it is what it is. We just have to find practices that cultivate more love and compassion. I think Milarepa's story is very cool for that. Turning, darkness into light, water into wine, this kind of transformational aspects of spirituality and different meditative practices that are life-changing and, really teach us to let go of negative emotions, karmic actions, and really forgiving ourselves. And, Milarepa's story was a lot about that. It was about finding forgiveness for himself, for his mother, and really underneath it all, it is that, yeah. As much as we can blame people for doing horrible things, people only, hurt people, yeah. There's something that they've gone through in their life that's caused them to act and behave that way. And I think that when we see that in others, we have much more understanding. And I think that someone else said this, and I thought this was very true, is that some of the most influential saints in history had also done quite bad things in their life. And I think that it's because they've got a deeper understanding, yeah? If you've done something very bad in your life and you've found peace and equanimity through that, you have a lot more compassion for other people, yeah? Because you've been through it. You know what that's like. You know what it's like to be in a bad place and to mistreat others potentially. You know what it's like to be damaged yourself and to hurt others inadvertently, yeah? So you have a lot more compassion for other people that are also in that space, because you know that there's potential for them to change. There's potential for them, to transform and shift that negative energy into positive energy. But that comes from truth. It comes from seeing things as they really are, which is why I'm not into kind of cotton walling things and, acting like things don't exist. Some confrontation in life is good. Meeting people with reality and truth can lead to love and compassion. I'm not really into this modern yoga thing around, making everything smiley and acting like everything's perfect, because that's not true, yeah? Having an argument with someone and being confrontational potentially, if it's based on the goal for truth, is a good thing, yeah? I think of Milarepa's and Marpa's story. The intention behind it wasn't just to be mean to someone. The intention was to kind of find truth. And sometimes finding truth with someone is difficult. They don't want to go there. They want to believe their own stories. So to get the truth out you might have to go through something very uncomfortable. And I think being all right in that uncomfortableness is the superpower, because it enables you to sit back and observe a little bit until the truth comes to light. This is a very good skill set, I think, to have in life, so that you're okay with things being uncomfortable, and potentially, the truth comes out. And really, when the truth comes out, healing can begin. I don't think anything really good comes from lying and being dishonest and not saying things how they are, and being direct and honest, even if it's uncomfortable, will always lead to the truth. But really, it takes a strong mind, a big heart, patience, and a lot of love to see the wound in another person. And I think that really, if you're not taking those things personally, this is another superpower. Yeah, it's a very difficult thing to do. Yeah, is to see the pain in someone else, to have compassion for someone else, even if that person is mean and unkind to you or is harming you in some way. And that can take a lot of, that is a yogic practice just on its own. Yeah, that is a big project in your yoga practice. Like, are you able to cultivate love and compassion when life gets hard? Yeah, it's like the ultimate test. And then you can go from avoiding pain and discomfort, moving into this other space. And I think that is a superpower. Yeah, in my experience of life, being able to cultivate that feeling, even when something very difficult, painful is going on, and having a big heart for that is like the ultimate test. And over the years, I've seen these experiences like that. Rather than trying to avoid uncomfortable conversations and arguments with people or disagreements, I've chosen to go into them in quite a strong way, because I've learned so much from these things. Yeah, I think that really you could look at them as a test for your yoga practice. Yeah, I heard someone else say this once, but if you're just out in a monastery in the Himalayas meditating all day, it's cool, and I'm sure you find a lot of peace and love, but are you able to do that in the marketplace? Are you able to do that in the confines of a city or a town you live in? It's a good test to see how your yoga practice is going when you're uncomfortable and you're not getting your needs met, or you're not getting what you want. How do you react? How do you deal with those things? No judgment. I don't deal with those things very good all the time. It's not a case of judgment. It's more of an observation of how is our yoga practice doing? How is it working? How are we in those situations? Are we able to find love and compassion? Are we more patient? It's interesting to think how we react when we're in these different spaces. But that said, I still might move to the countryside and live in a little cabin somewhere, because I think it's coming to that time in my life where I think that might be necessary to just retreat a little bit and find a bit more peace in nature. I think it's getting to that point. But anyway, I digress. I think I will leave it there, and it's probably I've said enough on that. Ciao.